Ladies and gentlemen, guys and girls, welcome to another episode of the Age of Warfare podcast. I am Satorian Actionist Maximus. That is the gate, Aiden Codier. And today we got a fun topic, at least for those who live in the UK. And there's
Sorry about that. An ambulance has
the,
just stopped
the
outside my
ambulance.
window.
Sorry about that, folks.
It's
Uh,
gone. It's gone. Sorry.
So today's episode is about the United Kingdom, because as Aiden pointed out to me, July 4th was election day in the United Kingdom. So we're going to talk about how the elections affect the United Kingdom, but also how history has the UK history has evolved since they were part of the Roman Empire to now. So as always, how are you today, my friend?
I'm good. I'm good. It was so went to work this morning and it was a nice relaxing day. Weather's not too bad. We've had a couple of really rainy days as well. So the humidity's dropped quite a lot as well. So it's just
Oh
nice
yeah,
warm weather, which is it's the humidity that's the killer. So yeah, it's not a nice pleasant day. I'm enjoying it, and I've got
yeah.
tomorrow off, so
All
all
right.
the better.
So basically, traditional UK weather,
Yeah,
traditional
yeah,
English
yeah.
weather.
Yeah, we had a
All right,
week of summer, and that's all we're getting. Yeah.
all right. So anyway, I'm not going to waste too much time. Let's get into the meat of the topic today, Aiden. So I mean, this was a topic that you wanted to talk about so badly because you had the UK elections on July 4th. Before we get started, why July 4th? Because it so happens to fall on the same day as Independence Day here in the United States. So you know,
Oddly enough, yeah, it was a very big question in Parliament. So for years, traditionally, the national election had to be called by the Prime Minister, and it would be between 4 and 6 years. So roughly every 5 years, you'd have a national election. But then the leading party, the one that was in power at the time, then had a
mhm.
lot of sway to call it exactly when they wanted. So when they were doing really well, they go, right, we'll have the election now, so they could stay in power. There was then a change in law that said it was called every 5 years, that you had to have it every 5 years, regardless if it happens to be the party's done really well for 4.5 years, and in that 6 months leading up to election they've done badly. Well, that's their problem. They should have done better. Which, when you're talking about politics and politicians, is you can kind of like be quite that forceful. The problem we then had was the Conservatives, after Brexit, the Conservatives struggled with their leaders because their party was split over Brexit. So you had some of the leaders, some of the top party people were for Brexit, and some of them were against Brexit. So Cameron, who actually called the Brexit vote, there were loads of different reasons behind it, but he was against leaving Europe. So when Brexit was called, he then stepped down as prime minister. Now we don't then instantly have a general election. The party in power, because we don't vote for the prime minister, it's the
Mhm.
leader of the party. So the party internally will then vote for who they want to be their leader of their party. That becomes the prime minister. That's another election race which is covered, but you have to be a member of the party. So similar to the US, where you choose your presidential candidate, think of it in those terms of that
Uh-huh.
happening. But the people don't decide; the members of the party decide. Which obviously the people can if they're members of the party. But being a member of a political party in the UK is a lot rarer. Obviously, in the US, it's very common to be a signed up Democrat or Republican. In the UK, it's a lot rarer to actually be signed up to any of the parties. There are people who are generally aligned to different parties. So, for example, I work for the Co-op. Co-op tends to be relatively left-leaning and union, so it tends to align with Labour, but isn't necessarily like the workers aren't sort of forced into voting that way or anything.
Yeah.
But generally, where you've got a strong union, then a company or a business may then favour Labour quite often. So it's the core support comes from general groupings rather than being members. Because of that, so you had Cameron step down because he was like, well, it's Brexit. I didn't want Brexit, so I'm not going to be able to handle this properly. Or let's have a leader of the party and a prime minister who will do this for you. The problem is the people who wanted Brexit in the Conservative Party didn't really have a plan. So we then went through a selection of prime ministers, several snap elections. We had an election every 18 months at one point, a national election. And there were loads of local elections, people standing down, but the political landscape changed. But that was when this 5-year cycle was supposed to be starting, so it was a bit of a mess. This is we're now out of the other side of it, and this is our first definite 5-year one. But that also means there isn't a set date in the year. So it used to be traditionally is the third week of March. As when you, however, party in charge gets to decide on the date. That's the give and take on the, yes, you can't decide the year, but you can decide when in the year. Now, the Conservatives generally garner a lot of the older population vote for Conservatives. Younger people tend to vote for Labour. That's the general division. Younger people who are politically active will go out in any weather. Older people, you tend to not want it to be in the middle of winter, because then you get things like fuel crisis, old people freezing in their homes and things like that. And that then means that the Conservatives look bad if they're in power. So you do it in the middle of summer when it's the easiest to get their people out. I don't know why they specifically chose the 4th of July. It was a Thursday. Our elections always happen on Thursdays. So they decided at the beginning of July. It just so happened that the 4th was the Thursday. They didn't decide on the 4th. They decided the first Thursday for the election. And it just happened to coincide. There's probably some weird internal machinations where they worked out on loads of numbers of their best date for the election. But yeah, it's a bizarre date to have it. And it was quite funny that it was on Independence Day for you guys.
Yeah.
Quite fun as well. That obviously affects our online election things as well, because people in the US are going to be posting up a lot of things about the best things about the US, as you do on Independence Day. And then you'll have your stuff about fireworks, your stuff about barbecues, your stuff about actually having some time off and not being made to feel guilty about it.
Right.
And so you got this happy ethos from the US side as well. So I don't know if that was a factor in their decisions on social media, where it covered several things. Can I just have 2 seconds?
Yeah, because it's fun. Because Aiden's meeting. Because it's funny. Because I never been so focused on the United Kingdom elections, but with Aiden, it was like I was getting a note. I was getting a commentary on what was going on in the United Kingdom with the Labour Party and the Conservatives and all this. You know, Aiden did a really good job giving me the commentary, giving us the commentary of what's going on. It was like the Super Bowl for you guys. It was like
that's the phrase that I used. It's my Super Bowls. I'm not really that into sports, but when it comes to big elections, I remember when we had a national election at the same time as as when Trump got in. We had our national election was within a week of it or something insane. And I booked the next days off work so that I could stay home and watch both of the elections. That's the kind of thing I do. That's what I do for fun, because I'm such a fun person, apparently. But yeah, it was quite interesting, the questions that you guys were giving me as well about press. And they're things that I wouldn't consider, being a British person steeped in everything British and obviously politics in general.
Now I'm gonna go on a bit of a tangent. We're gonna go back in time here, because obviously that's what we like to do on the show. As even though current events are fun to talk about, I want to go back because the main England, right? The name England is derived from the Old English name of England, which means the land of the Angles. Like we were talking about this before the show. So basically, the Anglo tribe were the original, inhabitants of England after Rome gave up on the British Isles. They surrendered the British Isles. And then you had the Saxons. So I wanted to ask you, Aidan, the Angles, would you consider more in the Labour Party or the Conservative Party? Or So it's kind of an
So-
interesting question.
So the way that goes, so with that period, obviously, as you said, obviously you have Angles and you have Saxons over. So the UK is generally, if you go back to that period, you've got the Scottish, which were an Irish tribe that had
Celtic,
taken
right.
the opportunity to get rid of the
Mhm.
Picts.
Right.
Obviously, Ireland is doing what Ireland's doing.
Mhm.
Wales is generally like Wales had always been, actually relatively stable through a lot of history after the Romans as well. But England had you had the British who were here first, so they're derived from the Celtic tribes who were in Britannia, and then the Jutes is generally the area of Kent. The Angles is we still call it East Anglia, so that's your Norfolk, Suffolk, that area, Cambridgeshire, up around that bit that sticks out on. If you look at a map, right hand side, that blob, that's East Anglia. And then you've got the territories that became the very Saxon territories, which tend to be in the south. So they have the sex prefix. So you've got Essex, Sussex, Wessex, which doesn't exist
Wessex.
anymore, but it's split up. So you've got all of those names are still in use. You can still see those areas.
Well, East Anglia tends to be more Anglo, if I'm correct.
Yeah, so one of the other things that comes along with that is when the Vikings turn up, they being termed the Vikings, they were from the same areas, all of these Angles and Saxons and the various other tribes that come from as well. And they were, a lot of them, actually Saxon tribes. The reason that England's called England is it was decided, Alfred the Great, it's that period, where they're fighting against the great heathen army. They need to distinguish themselves from these Saxons, even though they themselves were Saxons who were just there beforehand. But as an amalgamation of Angles and Saxons, they went with Angle, the land of the Angles, so that they're the Saxons, we're the Angles, create that separation. Hence why it's England. Otherwise, we would be called Saxony. Was obviously a distinct possibility. If it had been a lot of Angles coming over as part of the Vikings, would have probably gone for Saxony. Obviously, Saxony exists in Germany, which would have caused some confusion, but that's European place names always cause confusion anyway. So what you have then is you have a Scandinavian influence as well, especially when you get into the northern parts of the country.
Right.
The big thing is those tribes are all mixed together so much as well. And then you've got to remember the Normans came over. When the Normans came over, it kind of made a cohesion amongst. That's when the English start to become the English. So those divisions between Saxon, the Scandinavians who by then integrated to a certain extent, because obviously the Norman invasion was the end of the Viking period, because the reason that the Normans managed to take the country was because they were fighting Vikings. The Saxons too busy fighting against the Vikings, Normans come and take over. But that means everyone sort of came together underneath the Norman yoke, as it were. As part of that, because a lot of the north of the country was the Viking settlements were in the north. So you think places like York is quite famous for it. You had the Normans fighting them, and they refused to surrender. So you had something called the Harrowing of the North, where the North got utterly obliterated. So you're talking Doomsday Book, that time period, 1086 as well, for those years afterwards, with William's son, William Rufus. And it changes sort of which areas of the UK are like they are, and their the cohesion of those areas. So, for example, Yorkshire has a big independent streak, which the Northern Territories were also used to fight against Scotland. So we like to have quite warlike lords up there as well to protect that border. Those lords, which obviously is where you get the Tudors from. You get the White Rose and the Red Rose, the Lancastrians and the Yorkists. Lancaster and York were in the north. That's the two big northern lords that were fighting it out amongst each other with succession. Obviously, that goes into weird bits of history. But so you end up with this sort of divide where you've got the north in general, And then you've got the south and the southern coast. So the southern coast, especially where the Jutes are, so sort of Kent, is very closely tied to Northern Europe. So we've talked to our Dutch friend about trade. That was on that night as well, on the election night, about the trade between England, the English and the Dutch, especially around the 1400s and later. Up to the 1600s, that sort of time period. So the north, on the other hand, it was still England as it had been in the medieval period, in that transition period.
Correct.
So the way that the country ended up settling is London then becomes an economic hub. You've got a lot of trade on the southern ports as well. And then, obviously, when you get to the industrial age, you get a lot more in the north. So you get your northern ports, your Liverpool, Hull, places like that. It gets into the geography more, which divides what people did as a job. So the old mining areas, which are the Midlands, Margaret Thatcher closed the mines. Weirdly enough, Labour closed a lot more mines before that, but it was the way in which they were closed. The mines were basically running out and they were costing more to run than they were making. So something needed to be done, otherwise you'd have all these people out of work. So Labour had this scheme where they were shutting down the mines slowly over a period of time and then finding those miners jobs. When Thatcher did it, that second part didn't come to fruition. I don't know if they had a plan because the Thatcher government ended up collapsing, and then John Major came in and tried to sort things out. And then he wasn't in very long because people were unhappy. So you ended up with this block across the Midlands where they'd vote for Labour because of Thatcher closing down the mines, and rightfully or wrongfully, but that was the ethos as well. Liverpool very strongly was anti-conservative for a very long time. After 2016, the Labour strongholds ended up getting absolutely demolished in an election. So it's a bit more up for grabs now. But what you tend to see is a bit like in the US with the Democrats and Republicans. The Labour tend to be more where you get concentrations of workers, not the rural people. The rural people tend to vote Conservative, and the people in the urban areas tend to vote for Labour. But that's because those parties came out of the ethos of the Industrial Revolution. So that old history of the Angles and the Saxons and the makeup of England itself has kind of gone away. The only place you really do see that come up is in Scotland with the SNP. So you get the Highland Scots and you get the Lowland Scots. Lowland Scots are
because now I'm looking at the political parties of the United Kingdom. There's a whole lot of political parties.
We've got tons, absolutely tons.
And you even got political parties of England and Wales, the Green Party.
Yeah. So the full name of the Conservative Party is the Conservative and Unionist Party. They're actually two political parties that merged way back. I can't remember when they merged. I think it was in the 1800s, possibly. Which is why the Conservatives often have a strong showing in Northern Ireland, because it's about the Union. They're all about the original 1707 was the Union, and then there were further acts. But that's the original Act of Union. That Act of Union is where a lot of this stuff with the SNP comes from. So when England and Scotland merged under one crown, Scotland ran out of money because their colonies all failed, so they were bankrupt. But they had a monarch. We had run out of monarchs, inbreeding, killing each other off, various different things. But we still had loads of money because we'd had successful colonies. So the deal was, we bailed out Scotland financially, and then Scotland gave us the monarch. So our monarchs that's where the Stuarts come from. So you had weirdly enough, there hasn't actually been, there wasn't actually an English house on the throne for many years. So first of all, you get the Normans turn up. Well, they're not English. And then that goes up through the Plantagenets, and they slowly become English. And then obviously until you start entering towards the Tudor period. So when you get to the Tudor period, the Tudors are actually Welsh. Then they get supplanted by the Stuarts, who was Scottish. And then once we get rid of the Stuarts, eventually, who were very troublesome royal family, hence major civil war, cutting the king's head off, all of that stuff. When Charles II was actually okay, James II was crap. So we ended up getting William of Orange. So then when we had William and Mary, so that's the Dutch, and that's where a load of the stuff from Northern Ireland comes from as well. Hence the Orange Marches, William of Orange. Makes sense. Then after that, that line collapsed. We then went and got a bunch of Germans as well from the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. That was all the way up until the First World War, when we were at war with Germany, where they changed the family name to Windsor, because that's the castle where they had their main residence, was Windsor. So they changed the family name because Saxe-Coburg-Gotha isn't a name you want your royals to have when you're at war with Germany. Then obviously the current king's dad was Greek as well. Greek naval officer from the Second World War, actually. He was a very interesting man. So you don't really have a lot of these sort of English the families from these different areas all mixed in with the monarchy, and it's one of the reasons we keep the monarchy separate from what people decide in the Commons. It was the Civil War that really galvanised that as well, where it was decided with the monarch has the army. It's the king's now, so it's the king's army. The king's not allowed to declare war. Parliament is the only people allowed to declare war because it is the Parliament of the people. However, they are not allowed an army, otherwise you may potentially have a civil war. So they have to ask the king if they can borrow his army to go to war. It's all just rubber stamps and formalised stuff now. In practice, it doesn't really work that way anymore. But that's the history of how that came about. But because of those divisions and a lot of the stuff that happened in the 1800s in the Industrial Revolution, our political landscape is kind of based on that. And this, the Act of Union between England and Scotland has always had this rivalry of Scotland being a lot smaller, and then as soon as you have a democracy based on number of people, we're a tenth of our size. So they've got a disproportionate number of seats in the House of Parliament for their population. And there's something called the Barnett Formula. I won't go into it. Look it up if you're really interested. It became a massive argument. That's where the SNP really made their gains trying to sort this out. So Scotland, so we decided to devolve a lot of powers. So you have the Northern Ireland Assembly, you have the Welsh Assembly, and you have the Scottish Parliament. They each have their own group of people that they elect, like we elect to Westminster. England is the odd one out. We don't have an English Parliament, but the UK Parliament sits in Westminster, of which each constituent part of the UK comes to. This was a big argument in that. So going back to what you said about the Saxons, I was describing how you had this difference between the North and the South. In Yorkshire, this election as well, there was a Yorkshire Independence Party of Yorkshire trying to become independent as well. It didn't get many votes but it shows how they feel that they're different. Their cultural heritage is more towards that Viking end of things as well. And Scotland, the separation of Scotland, there had been calls under the SNP as well, a lot of calls to have Scotland leave the Union, partly due to Brexit as well. So there's still this idea that even though, especially lowland Scotland in England, and the southern coast of Wales especially, it's all pretty much the same people with varying accents. There's no real difference between us. Obviously, you've got some different cultural differences when you look deeper, but in general, on a day-to-day basis, we're pretty much the same. However, there's still this is Scotland, this is Wales, this is England, and those divides come up when, because England's got so much control over the Union, you get this pushback, hence the devolution. So those tribal elements of we are this group of people do come into it. And that split between the North and the South as well. The South, where there's a lot of money, tends to, obviously, people who have more money tend to vote Conservative. And then Labour tended to be more northern thing, especially with the industrial areas, because it was about workers' rights as well, and seeing that the South had the money. So you do get that divide, but it's more to do with the divide between what was England under Alfred and what was the Danelaw. Is actually it's slightly different on a map, but it's actually closer comparison between the division. But you do get these nuances around. But the divisions between the Angles and the Saxons were basically settled when the Normans turned up. Right. Everyone was like, "Wow, we've got to deal with these guys now, so we'll change up and deal with that."
What I find interesting, Aidan, I was comparing just now. I was kind of looking at the American parties to the UK parties. The American parties, it's legitimately a two-party system, and that's it. You know, there's no room for independent parties or other parties to join in. You know, it's either you're on this side or on this side. Because if you're in the middle, you're basically wasting your vote. You're basically saying, you're not gonna win. That now
it's
in the
protest votes essentially.
Protest votes, yeah, basically saying none of them are any good, but you're not doing anything because you're still helping one or the other. You're helping Biden or Trump, but I don't want to get into that. That's a whole different mess.
Yeah, that's a different episode.
Yeah. Now the UK politics, though, even though it is kind of neighbor against conservative, you do have a significant third party, the Liberal Democrats.
Yeah.
You know, and even the SNP does make some noise, and of course you got this new party called Reform UK, or the Brexit party. You know, they've made some noise as well. But you see, Aidan, contrary to America, UK, there's a wider net. You don't have to vote Labour or Conservative. You can vote for something different. Even the Green Party has some people in the lower house. The Green Party. Now in America, the Green Party, it might as well not even exist.
So one of the interesting things about it is obviously because we have the first past the post system. So, and this is something that I was describing when I put up a couple of messages in our private group for this to give an idea. But it bears repeating that obviously on the podcast. So the basic makeup of our government is we have 650 seats across the UK. There are literally 650 seats in Parliament. Our Parliament is decided, it's the physical size of the building and the amount of seats that are physically in the building. That's how we decided. It's weird, but it's very practical in that sense. So the UK is divided up into 650 roughly equal-sized areas. If you know anything about our population, you're talking 100,000-ish. But when you add in children, European areas, some areas have a lot more Europeans or immigrants. London areas as well. If you're not a national, you don't get to vote in a national election. Local elections, depending on what nationality you are, you can. That means realistically you're looking at about 75,000 people per constituency, roughly. There are some edge cases. Some of the island groups in Scotland, for example, have a lot less people. Areas of Northern Ireland as well. Otherwise, it would just be Northern Ireland had one vote, which would just be weird. So it's too geographically there is some difference. It's not as pronounced as say in the US, where you've got states that have less people in than the biggest cities as well, that have as much, if not more, say in government than the people in those cities. So our votes are diluted to a certain extent, certain areas, certain MPs, generally where urban areas where you've got more people. It's a thing. There's no way around it when you're trying to do constituencies. We do have a group that sorts it all out, and they change them up slightly every so often. So anyway, 650 areas. When it becomes the election, government gets dissolved. Everyone's told, right, it's on this date. You've got 6 weeks to campaign. On this date, no longer have a government. You've got between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m. to go and cast your ballot. You rock up. Everyone gets a polling card. You can vote by post beforehand, various different other methods as well. Now we have voter ID because it got pushed by the. Yeah, that's a stupid US idea that the Conservatives tried over here because I think we had 3 people in one election that were actually arrested for voting illegally, and out of those 3 people, 2 of them were Conservative. And in fact, no, 2 of them were students who had misread the things, because students can vote in 2 areas in some elections. It's weird how that works because they're technically living in 2 places. So local elections, they have to decide which, but it's quite unclear. And it turned out that these 2 were playing on that and went, oh no, we didn't know. But they were obviously at university and should have known better. But yeah, it was 3 people. So we have to have voter ID. It's ridiculous. You can use a bus pass for voter ID. It's insane. Either way, we get a polling card that tells you where your polling station is. Usually a local community centre, village hall, or when major urban areas like ours, the primary school gets closed down for the day and everyone goes and votes at the primary school, because primary schools are obviously dotted quite nicely between each of the areas. So families, therefore, they're quite easy to use. You go down there, you get a pencil, you get a piece of paper, you have a list of people with a big box next to it. It tells you what party they're from, it gives you their address. So it's name, address, party, the symbol of their party, big box at the side, and the bit at the top says, put an X in the square that of the person you want to vote for. Don't mark the paper in any other way. You take your big chunky pencil, you scrawl your X in who you want to vote for, fold that slip in half, slide it into the special box that they have. Someone with a stick pokes them down to make sure that no one can get them back out again. You say goodbye and then you go away. And then at 10 p.m, place closes. Those boxes go over to where they count them. They are then dumped out onto a table in front of people that count them. Those people divide them up and go, right, cool, we'll divide that. That's 10 for that one. They pass on to the next person. They double check that they're correct. That then gets put on. Those boxes are then reused. They put all of the votes for that party in that box, that party in that box, and so on. So those totals are then, well, it takes, 2 hours to actually count the votes per constituency. It's incredibly quick. I think there's a race on for who can get the votes out first as well. It's kind of a pride. There's 2, I can't remember which constituencies, there's 2 of them. And every year they compete for who can get their votes out first.
Yeah, the complete opposite of over here. It's the complete opposite.
Differences over here. But when we have an election, we have them all separate. So I've seen US election. You vote for everyone for everything.
Yes.
We don't do that. So we now vote for. We've got certain areas have mayors that are voted for. London being the famous one that's really always had that. We have police commissioners that people vote for. People go and vote for the police commissioner. I vote for the police commissioner. I have no idea who any of these people are. So people generally vote on party lines or go, I like that person's name. Here's your vote. It's the most pointless system because a police commissioner should just be the most high-ranking police officer in the area. That's generally how it was always done, but apparently that's the wrong way to do it. Anyway, if you have something like that happen at the same time, you get a separate piece of paper that has exactly the same format. It will just be a different colour. You put it in a different box. So then they'll count the most senior elections. So go national election, local election, mayor. I think I'm getting this in the right order. Might not be, but it's national election first always, then local election, then which includes by-elections, which may happen at the same time. I won't go into by-elections, but then you get your mayoral elections and then any other ones that are afterwards. Exactly the same process. So once that person's counted those votes and passed on, they can move on to the next election. It's very, very quick to do that because we are voting for the MP of the area. So actually, when you're voting over here, it's only 75,000 people that you're deciding amongst. So the thing that takes the longest is actually the Scottish Islands, which it depends on the weather because the votes have to be taken to the official place by light aircraft. And it depends if the plane can fly fast enough or what the weather's like for the plane. That's the thing that slows some of the Scottish votes down. But apart from that, it's literally stick them in a van, drive them next door. I mean, half the place is the place where they count them. It's one of the reasons to do it in a primary school. You vote in one place, and then they'll probably use the primary school's hall to actually count the votes. Simple, easily done. X on piece of paper, inbox, very traditional. We don't use any electronics for it. There's no point in using electronics. Don't fix what isn't broken.
Right.
That then means that each area, once they've counted, so obviously then you get recounts when they're close. It has to be within a certain amount. Obviously, all postal votes have already been counted while people are voting. So that's what those people that are counting votes are doing, because the postal votes, well, they've already come in. They're kept separately, so they count them all. So they already know those ones. And then you have the exit polls, so people have a rough idea. So sometimes people will concede at the beginning, like it happened in this election for some of the Conservatives. They're like, I'm just going to get absolutely destroyed because Labour are going to get in. So you had well done to the other candidate. But it's like Lee thought that Labour had already won and the voting hadn't even closed. But it was the exit polls, people coming out and going, yeah, I voted for this party, which is a dangerous thing to do because, as happens, people come out and then people lie to those people because a lot of people don't like people asking questions about your private vote outside.
Yeah, right. Yes.
Just tell them whatever nonsense it comes out. I know I've done it before. Like, I tend to vote fairly left wing, and I'll come out and just tell them, yeah, I vote for the BNP. You know, really right wing, like Go England and stuff like that. And they're like, oh, very good, very good. Like, yeah, I just completely ruined your statistics there, mate. Because
right.
So you do get, but the exit polls, once you gather all the data. But yeah, that's why it's so quick, because we compartmentalized it into these very small bits as well, which then aids us quite well when we're working through what's actually going to happen. And then once that's happened, you get your local MP. Brilliant. You just 650 of them. Once that's all settled, it takes, polls close at 10 p.m. We'll know by 4 a.m. At 4 a.m., winner is generally declared, unless it's a very, very close election, in which case it's probably 7 a.m. At that point, it's then literally a case of you count how many members, how many MPs a party has. The one that's got the most, their leader becomes prime minister, and then they set up a cabinet. Like all the people to do the top important jobs. Second place is the opposition party. Their leader becomes the opposition leader, and then they set up a cabinet that's called the shadow cabinet, which is all the same positions, but it's a shadow cabinet. They go along to those meetings as well, so it's bipartisan. So it isn't just a case of the people in charge get to decide whatever. Everyone else, the opposition, fights for everyone else. That's their job to do. Which is, so the system's incredibly simple, has some major flaws in it, which is something that I think we should get to as well, with the amount of votes cast as well, which was a very big issue in that we thought would come up and did come up in this election as well. So if you look at the spread of votes, if we have proportional representation, the Reform Party came a very close third. Conservatives didn't actually lose as badly, and Labour, their vote share does not show the seats that they've got for their proportional representation. The thing with that is, so Labour went tactically to win this particular election, which is something they do, but that's because they're playing into the traditions of how people vote. So you get something called safe seats, which is those people are always going to vote for Conservative or Labour. They will always, doesn't matter who the candidate is, they will always do that. Those, when you get those issues, there's something called rotten boroughs. So back into history, this happened a lot in the 17 and 1800s. There's something called rotten boroughs. So, like I was saying, how we divided it up now by the amount of people in the area, it had just been divided up by essentially county and the boroughs of a county as well. So you had areas where you'd have like 4 people. So you just get someone would turn up and go, all right, cool. Do you want a little bit of money? Yeah, cool. All vote for me. Right. The winner got 4 votes because there were only 4 votes, and they're now an MP. That party now has more say. So if you've got a lot of money, you can get a lot of seats by just having that candidate there. And in rotten boroughs, but you might even have no one else standing. as well, so you can win by default. So it happens in council elections occasionally as well, even to modern times. And it's one of the problems that we have with our voting system. That when we start having that happen more often, then there starts to be issues. But I don't see it getting much worse because we already had that old issues. Why we divide up our areas like we do now is all because we had the rotten boroughs issue. However, now because we've got so many people, proportional representation may be a better way of going for it, because otherwise we then have to double the number of people in Houses of Parliament, which means building a new Parliament building, and the country physically doesn't have the money for it. They tried a few years ago. We just don't have the money to build a new one.
Right. Now, I got a good question for you. I'm sure you know what gerrymandering is, right? I'm sure you're aware with it. Yeah, you know, manipulating the borders. I know that's a big problem here in the United States of gerrymandering. I know in New York City, they try to gerrymander parts of New York State to favor the Democrats, and the Republicans said, no, you're not doing that, and the judge struck it down. They try to redraw the districts in New York City to favor the Democrats, and the Republicans weren't having that. Now,
in the US, it's both parties doing it really, really badly as well.
Yeah,
there's a weird Republican one that's just a long line around.
Yeah, right. Now, is that a thing in the UK? Is gerrymandering a thing out there?
It's something that has come up, but our they're called the Electoral Commission, and they govern when the vote will be. They look into things like how much money a party has spent. So the parties are allowed a budget so that everyone can compete. They're also the people that collect the £500. Everyone gives a £500 deposit to stand for election as an MP. If you get over 1,000 votes, I think it is, you get your 500 back. It's a deposit. So the big parties tend to get the money back. But they're the people who deal with that. Also, there was a scandal right at the beginning of the campaigning where it turned out two of the senior Conservative Party members had been running an insider trading betting ring on that they would lose and how many votes the areas would get that they were standing for election in. They were betting on themselves to lose and then destroying their own chances. So they will deal with that as well. That's some UK corruption, but it was dealt with within days. They were out. The person realised that there was enough evidence, and obviously initially they were like, "Well, I didn't really do anything wrong," and then more evidence came out, and I went, "Right, cool, I'm resigning now. I'm going to go away." So that got resolved quite quickly. There's a certain amount of arguments that there is gerrymandering. However, it's, as I said, there in certain areas, it's just a factor of you can't just have this massive area having one MP and this smaller area, and then this one sort of more sort of city block having another one, because there's less for them to control the budgets, the way the councils work, and things like that. There's certain leeway in that. It does tend to favour the Conservatives, because as I said, Conservatives tend to get the more rural vote, the more traditional vote. But it's then up to the parties to go and get that vote. Labour needs to go to the rural people and go, cool, what do you want? And then answer their questions, which they did in a big way this election. It's their targeted seats thing as well to win the election. But the Electoral Commission there were a few hiccups a little while back, but essentially it was over like 2 areas, and they were pretty much safe seats anyway. So it wasn't as much of a contentious issue. But because of the way that we have them divided up, it's not so much of an issue with that as well. And it's also an independent body. And while, yes, it's an independent body under the government, is it really independent? It actually is quite independent. And this is what, remember what I said about there's a shadow cabinet?
A shadow cabinet, yes.
Yeah, this is the reason for having a shadow cabinet. So when there's a big transport issue and they bring people in to do that, you'll have the transport minister there. You'll also have the shadow transport minister there as well as the leader of the opposition. So you've got the heads of both sides there to make it bipartisan as well, which means makes it harder to. These checks and balances. It makes it harder for people to fudge the system in that way. And it was a big thing that people were very angry with the Conservatives about, because the several of the finances investigations, especially into COVID as well, where they told them they didn't do anything wrong. Literally, one of the MPs gave, I think it was 29 million to his pub landlord to produce masks. He's a landlord. It's a pub. They can't produce masks. They have got no manufacturing capability. So, and they were told, oh yeah, that's perfectly fine. So there are scandals like that, but they become a scandal, and then there's reform that comes along later. And often after that reform, they'll then go and look at that. So they'll form a commission, and the commission will look into it, and that will usually be people led by someone from the House of Lords. The House of Lords is weird. We won't go into the House of Lords. It's very weird, and they keep trying to get themselves fired by standing up and going, "Can some of us go home? We're very old. We don't want to be here." It's a bizarre situation. But you'll have someone from the House of Lords and generally top judge or someone. They'll be in charge of this commission, and they'll turn around and go, yeah, there was wrongdoing. Parliament needs to sit down and actually sort this issue out because you've been messing up here. Yet another check and balance that we have in our system as well. We also have a Supreme Court, which we've had for a few years, which has come under some backlash for being partisan.
Right.
And so someone from the US, I'm sure you know about partisan Supreme Court.
Yes, yes, we do. I mean, not just the United States, even here in Puerto Rico, there's a whole nother partisan. So that favor towards the PNP who want statehood. They tend to get a lot more of the breaks over the other main major parties here. So yeah, I'm well aware of partisan. Yes, I'm well aware of it.
So, but when we have stuff like that in the UK, so like your gerrymandering theory, it will hit the papers within days. If it looks egregious, there'll be a commission set up to look into it. It will take 10 years to have a look at it, and it'll have changed 3 times afterwards, and nothing will come of it. But the mere fact that a commission has been set up to look into something usually puts the people who've done it on notice of, let's change that back very quickly, because if they don't, then the commission, this is why people don't often get prosecuted after a commission, because they make sure everything gets fixed. It's like, think of it in the way of, you go into a shop to shoplift. If the security guards are looking at you, you're not going to shoplift because you know you're going to get picked up. If no one's looking at you, then you're more likely to shoplift. It's that situation of, as soon as a commission is set up, that's equivalent of them hiring a second security guard to look at you and make sure you're doing things correctly. So you then make sure you've scanned everything through the till, because you don't have just one wandering around the shop, you have one looking at you at the tills. It's that kind of situation. And just the mere fact of being looked into often fixes a lot of things. And as I said, with the scandal during the election on the betting, the guy resigned. He turned around and was like, well, they're looking into me. My political career is essentially at an end. And they will just resign very, very quickly. And often the biggest scandals are because someone doesn't resign. Boris Johnson, classic example of that during COVID, where he was caught. And he was fine because he made a law, he passed it into law, he then broke the law repeatedly, was found to have broken the law, and then his party went, no, he didn't. And it's like, they're literally videos of him breaking this law, and they were like, actually, yeah, he kind of, yeah, he did. And then he was fined. It's like, you chose this guy to be our prime minister, which is why the Conservatives ended up getting a lot of backlash, because they kept trying the whole gaslighting people thing.
Yeah, it's like what's happening. Yeah, it's like what's happening to Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey. They caught him accepting bribes from Egypt. You know, so right now all the Democrats they abandoned Bob Menendez. They've abandoned him, even though it's still the case is still being tried, but they don't want nothing to do with him because it's not the first time he's been busted for bribery. He got accused back in 2015. He beat those charges, but it kind of ruined his reputation. But now with Egypt, and you know the United States and Egypt aren't necessarily friendly towards each other. You know, Egypt.
The Arab Spring kind of changed that situation as well.
Yeah,
The
so
reason that the US and Egypt were friendly is because you guys sodded us over during the Suez crisis. You came in and messed it all up, and we ended up.
yeah,
That is quite a
but
violent thing, which is a bit of weird history for you.
yeah, but that's the American equivalent of what you're talking about.
Yeah,
Something,
yeah.
or even Donald Trump, or even Donald Trump himself. But I'm not trying to make this political, so
Or
you know,
Biden over Biden's
yeah,
latest speech as well. People
that too,
distancing
right?
themselves from him. So you
That
get,
too,
and it's one
yeah.
of the biggest players
hmm
in politics, especially in the
hmm
Western world in general. Of if someone's doing something horrendous, even if they don't get consequences like you or I might get, you'll often find that their careers are basically over because people don't want to be around them because as soon as they are, things go horribly wrong. Look at Nigel Farage. He's now an MP in our country. He's the head of the
hmm
Reform Party. He's gone through God knows how many parties that have sort of got somewhere. He was a member of the European Parliament until he pushed Brexit and essentially got himself fired, which is a weird situation to be in. But it turned out it's because he was embezzling money, so they ended up fining him. He tried to be an MP. This is the 8th time he's tried to be an MP as well. And what he was doing through all of this was being part of Trump's campaign. And then everyone around him was getting arrested for all of these dodgy things. He is known and has been convicted for dodgy things as well. So he ran away back to the UK and to the head of his party. And one of the big things that's said about him is he's very good at playing the game of politics. We have something called the Ministerial Code, which is what part of this is. If you breach the Ministerial Code, which is kind of like at work, obviously there are things that will get you fired. So I work in a shop. If I start stealing things from the shop, well, I'm going to get fired. But that's just a basic you don't do. But if our ethos in the shop is the way that we talk to each other, is that, and you're not part of that ethos, is if you do that like once, you might get a talking to, and it might escalate eventually to you getting fired of like, look, you're just a horrible person in this workplace, you don't fit in, but it's caused issues for the business because of said thing. Then we can get rid of you. The ministerial code is that kind of thing, but for an MP, but it's a little bit stricter. So they have a few more rules on them. So things like there was a massive scandal. So MPs get expenses because they've got to be in their constituency and they've got to be in Westminster. So they have money given to them. So they have a place in the capital and a place where they are. Because they have two places, they get subsidies for that. There's also subsidised food in the House of Parliament, things like that. Also, they're expected to take foreign diplomats and things like that to nice, posh places for the country, so they're reimbursed for things like that. There was a massive scandal where they were putting things on expenses they shouldn't have been. There was one guy who spent like £10,000 on a duck house for his pond in his back garden and then claimed it on expenses. It's like, well, that isn't anything to do with the government. What are you doing? That was one of the worst ones, well, one of the funniest ones. It's why everyone remembers it. But the ministerial code, sort of, it's about how they act as a person. It might be actually close to, say, the code of conduct for a police officer. That a police officer will, if they're seen, it might be perfectly legal for them to get drunk in the pub, but it's recommended that they do not get drunk in a pub or be around large groups of football fans chanting, because that's so avoiding those situations, while not illegal, it's not seen as you upholding what you're there to do. So with that, Nigel Farage will play there. He will follow that code. So actually, what he will do is he will stick to his guns, and he will. All of those people, they've got what, 5 MPs, I think they got in the end. So Reform got all of those votes, but it looks like he's actually going to stand up for the people that voted for his party, and them having a voice, I think, is really good. Much as I don't like the guy, the fact that he's in Parliament to give them a voice is a good thing, because there's clearly a lot of anger out there by these people that have supported him, and he said what they wanted to hear. So, and he's likely to follow through on that, or at the very least, bring it up in Parliament where it will get discussed. That is the main thing. That's the whole point of us having individual MPs.
Right.
Any MP can bring up a topic in Parliament. Obviously, the more junior an MP, the less likely it is to come up at an important point. But they can still bring it up.
Now, I got a question. One more question before we got to wrap this thing up. The Reform UK Party. I've been hearing a lot of noise about the Brexit Party. What do you think is the future of that, of the Reform UK Party? What do you think would be the future of it?
So, the Brexit Party was originally UKIP, it's the UK Independence Party. And UKIP was actually, it was a TV presenter that was leading it, and it was a right-wing party. That sounds very familiar. But they started off in, I think it was Cornwall, it was Devon, Cornwall. It was that end of the country, quite a lot of support. And the reason for it was all to do with the EU Commission. It was the Farming Commission. Well, it was corrupt as hell at that point. And there were a lot of farms down there getting absolutely shafted. So this party came up. They wanted independence from the European Union because it was damaging the local economies. That then got picked up by Farage joining it, and then Kilroy Silk was the guy who originally founded it, I think. Or he was leader for a while anyway. He then picked that up, ran with it. That didn't get very far, so we changed the name to the Brexit Party. Now, Brexit was a specific one issue. That was it. They had one thing. Brexit happened. The party no longer has a reason to be. They tried to keep reforming it, and then they lost all the votes because Brexit's happened. Like, what else are you going to do? Like, we've left. Done. That you've succeeded. You've done your thing. You're no longer needed. And he kept forming other parties and switching it around. So Reform is Nigel Farage used to be a Conservative, and the Conservative Party. One of the reasons for calling Brexit was there's a lot of people in the Conservative Party that wanted to leave Europe, and they didn't want to split the vote because if their vote was split, Labour would win in a landslide. And what did we see in this election? They had no one issue like that to call a Brexit vote over. They had to reform what they were doing. They couldn't. So Nigel Farage's big thing is reforming the government to sort it out. That then split the Conservative vote between those two poles of idea, which meant that Labour won in a landslide, which was the exact thing to have a Brexit vote. So it shows through the history of the voting why that happened. So a lot of the noise about them is because his past parties have essentially just been one of the things about, I think it was either UKIP or when they were Brexit. This is the thing, I can't even remember what they were called at the time. They literally copied and pasted the Labour manifesto so they could try and get sort of your inner city workers who are builders. Like, I want my country to be my country, and I want like people to be supported at the same time, which is Labour worker heartlands. That is a thing. It seems like it's at odds, but it isn't at odds. It's protecting your workers' rights by making sure that it's British workers getting them. That was the ethos. That's what he was going for. So he copied the Labour manifesto and then just added in all the things about Brexit on top of it. So actually, most of the manifesto was fairly good. So that's one of the reasons he got a load of votes at one point as well. But the problem that I found with that was that exact tactic. And in fact, that campaign, one of the images they used for their campaign was a copy-paste of Nazi propaganda and the use of socialist party politics to try and gain a load of socialist votes for a right-wing idea was also used by the Nazis. Right. That's one of the reasons that I don't like him. He's played it too close to that to just try and garner votes from all sides at the same point. But we've seen it before. We don't want that happening again, which is where he faltered, was people are stupid. Say that. But his current platform in Reform, I don't like his ideas for fixing things. However, he's got a point. Like, the points that he's making need to be brought up. I don't like his solutions, but a lot of people don't like his solutions. A lot of people do like his solutions. But the issues that need to be talked about, which is why Reform are able to build up. It's the Conservative Party needed reforming. Reform is that reform of the Conservative Party. So eventually, a lot of those voters will go back to the Conservatives if they reform themselves. But essentially, you get those who vote vaguely right, those who vote vaguely left. Vaguely left tends to be Labour, vaguely right tends to be Conservative. And then depending on if there's a specific issue, you can get these massive splits within the parties where they'll pick up the second string parties. So if a Labour voters may move to Lib Dem or even Green, whereas the Conservatives don't often have another party, but some of them will go to Lib Dem, but a lot of them now have Reform to go to. And that is one of the things about, and that's why our system is built like it is. So our system, while it does have its faults, has that very good bit in it that, yeah, they got loads of votes, but not many seats. However, they are in Parliament to bring up those issues, which is the important point to have within the election. That all comes from having the country divided up. It's almost like proportional representation in a way of having a voice in Parliament, and that's the whole big thing in Parliament is to represent the Commons. The backlash against Keir Starmer is partly because he has a knighthood. He should not be in the House of Commons, in my opinion. He should be in the House of Lords. He's a Lord, he's not a commoner. A commoner is someone who does not have a knighthood. Traditionally, an ex-Prime Minister will be knighted or given a lordship, and they go into the House of Lords. He already has one. He shouldn't be in the House of Lords, which is why people are uneasy about him and why he doesn't use his title anymore, because people are uneasy about that. And there is still that back to medieval idea of the House of Lords that's where all the laws, the people who own all the land, the people who are in charge, that's where they get to decide things. House of Commons is for us average folks, and this is our voice. That is one of the big things about our system. And then the monarch has their voice, and that's the three-part system that we have in our elections. And that got very solidified after our Civil War. And a lot of our issues come with the House of Lords having less power, the monarch having less power, and then the House of Commons not being particularly common. Is one of the issues where it all comes together. Hence why Reform got a lot of vote, because a lot of the common average person, when these issues, I don't care if they've got solutions, they're not going to get into implement solutions, but they're going to bring up the issues. So it's a protest vote that is actually going to change things because it's protesting an issue, rather than, as you see in the US, a protest vote just doesn't really do anything.
It's just a waste of a vote. Yeah,
it's just a time out of your day to go and put a mark on a bit of paper. Rather than over here, it actually works. You do get this, and it makes the big parties stand up and go, hey, hang on a minute, we need to sort something out. People are clearly unhappy here, which is a nice part about our system. But that all goes back to our Civil War and why the Civil War happened. And that was when we were changing out of that really old medieval, here's the monarch idea, who's in charge. And then the boroughs and how everything is set up goes all the way back to the Saxons. And that is one of the connections to the Saxons, is having boroughs, because that was a Saxon idea as well. So yeah, all of those bits of history feed in and get stuck together. It's why US politics can seem very, very complicated as soon as you delve slightly below the surface. But in general, it's a relatively simple system. It's just, it allows for nuance. Further points. Yes, it does need reform, but we talked about this obviously in when we did the general Europe episode of things that Europe's got an issue with. And what to go back to what we said in that episode, the things that people were voting for in the current election were all of that stuff that we were talking about that Europe has issues with. All of those things go back and stem back, as we said, from history. And they've all come through. And those were the major talking points in our election currently as well. So that deep-seated history that people want to deal with is still relevant within our current elections and what's happened. And that's why the election fell like it did, was over those specific things. And this idea of, well, it was like that back then, so why can't we have it like that now? Because that's a good bit we used to have. We want that back. And you get along these essentially political tribal lines, but ours tend to be from the 1800s often. But also you then have this element of when the kingdoms were forming that goes right the way back to the medieval period, and those kingdoms were shaped out of what happened after the collapse of the Roman Empire as well. So if you didn't have all of that lead up, you wouldn't have Parliament as we have it now as well. It's like a lot of our titles are straight medieval titles. They don't do the same thing, but they're ministers. They're advisors to the king. Technically, our government is just the advisory body to the king in technical terms. In practical terms, no, it isn't. The king can't do anything. It's Parliament rules. House of Lords can complain occasionally, but that's about it. The Prime Minister is nigh on a president, just with a few checks and balances. That's essentially how it is, but we don't vote for them specifically. Because we separate the head of state. So, yeah, it's a weird situation. Actually, you go back to what we already said about all of this history, that it all connects in and dots all shape up to create this fairly simple system that gets tweaked by the whole history of the UK is what created how we have it now and why it works the way it does.
Yeah. Well, anyway, that was a wonderful episode, Aidan. We are well above the 1 hour mark. I mean, there's a lot to get into. And, well, we'll see how these elections in the UK affect your future coming up. So, but anyway, before we go, I want to remind people that me, Aidan, and many others are working on the charity anthology for Nee's daughter. So people are coming in with the stories. They're working on the stories. We're looking for a release sometime in October before Halloween. So how's your story coming in on?
It's I'm doing fairly well. There's I have an editor friend who I keep telling him when I finally sit down and write something, I'll send it to you, because I've wanted to use him as an editor for about 3 years now. And he messaged me the other day. So he that occasionally does, oh, have you got anything written, because he's got a few spaces open. I went, actually, it's not quite finished yet, but I have something. So that's obviously given me a bit of a deadline as well, because obviously I need to get it edited. But yeah, I've got the outline, and now I'm coming up to a few more days off. I'll be able to actually crack on with the story properly.
Yep.
I hate writing we've only got a few hours.
And I just want to give a quick shout out to DJ Cooper. She's the one who was in charge of this Written universe, the Written Undead, the book assignment, all this good stuff is because of her. And she is going to be doing the editing and the cover, I believe. She's going to be doing the cover. So she that's the one you send your stories to. So shout out to DJ Cooper. Thank you for all this that we're building and to helping us with the anthology. And I can't wait to see how it comes out.
All in line.
Yep. But so anyway, with that, I think it's time to say goodbye. So for Suetonian Antius Maximus, that was the gate, Aidan Collier. We're gonna see you in 2 weeks, and we're gonna have a whole new topic, and we're gonna decide on that topic. But I think Nee was coming up with a good idea about Alexander the Great. We could do a series about Alexander the Great, because there's so much to talk about. I know we spoke about him, but we never really got. I want to get granular. I think that's what Nee wanted to do. So we're going to be talking about that. So we'll see you in a couple of weeks, guys. But until then, I hope you enjoy your weekend. So take it easy, guys. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.